names that vanished from most family trees 100 years ago, buried under marriages, migrations, and the slow erasure of time. Names that sound like leftover fragments of a world that no longer functions, a world of emperors, bishoprics, and feudal offices. And yet, scattered across small villages in Bavaria, the Rhineland, Austria, and Switzerland, a handful of families still carry them. For centuries, these surnames were dismissed as curiosities. Interesting but meaningless. Historians assumed that a name like Truxus or Camera was simply an old job title someone's ancestor happened to hold. A fossil of language, nothing more. A surname was a label, not a bloodline. Then genetic genealogists started testing the men who still carried them. What they found did not confirm the old assumption. It complicated it. In some of these family lines, the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son for thousands of years, showed a level of internal consistency that should not have survived 7 or 8 centuries of ordinary drift. Something had preserved these lines with unusual precision, and that raised a question historians had never seriously asked. Were some of these names not just labels, but signatures of something older, a fragment of the administrative skeleton of the Holy Roman Empire itself, written into the genome? This is the story of 13 surnames, one empire, and what the DNA actually shows, not the exaggerated version, but the real one, which is stranger. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what a surname was in medieval Central Europe. Before the 12th century, most people did not have one. A man was simply Heinrich, son of Otto, or Otto the Miller. Surnames emerged gradually, and one of the most important sources for them was occupation, especially occupations tied to the courts of nobles, bishops, and eventually the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Some of these occupational names became extraordinarily specific. The empire had formal court offices, positions of enormous prestige, often hereditary, held by families who served the emperor directly. A Truxus was a steward, responsible for the imperial table and household. A marshal organized the emperor's horses, and by extension his armies. A Kammerer controlled the treasury and the private chamber. A Mundschenk was the cupbearer, trusted enough to be near the emperor's food and drink. Together, these 4 hereditary offices were known as the empire's great officers, and several German noble houses built their entire identity around holding one of them for generations. Alongside these came other names: Voigt, an administrative steward or bailiff who enforced law on behalf of a lord; Schultheiss, later shortened to Schulz, a local magistrate; Faulkner, a keeper of falcons for aristocratic hunts; Kellner, a cellarer who managed a household stores. Names like Bischof, Graf, Herzog, and Ritter echoed titles of rank itself: bishop, count, duke, knight, even though most people who eventually carried these surnames were not nobility at all, but servants, tenants, or villagers living in the shadow of those titles. That is the accepted history. A surname, in most cases, tells you what an ancestor did for a living, or who they served, not who they were biologically descended from. For most families, this remains true. A name is cultural inheritance, not genetic inheritance. But then came the first anomaly. In the early 2000s, geneticists studying Y chromosome data in the British Isles noticed something unexpected. Men sharing the same rare surname were, far more often than chance would predict, also sharing closely related Y chromosome signatures, even after 700 or 800 years of separate family lines. This became known as the surname DNA correlation, and it startled researchers, because surnames were supposed to be cultural labels, drifting freely from biology through remarriage, adoption, and the countless quiet infidelities every genealogist knows exist in every bloodline. The correlation should have dissolved generations ago. In many families it had, but in some, it had not. German researchers began asking whether the same pattern might exist east of the Rhine, particularly among the rarest, most occupationally specific surnames tied to the old imperial court structure. This is where the science had to be introduced carefully, because the tool being used was not vague folklore. It was the Y chromosome itself, a piece of the genome passed from father to son with almost no mixing, changing only through slow, trackable mutations. Unlike autosomal DNA, which blends every generation until an ancestor's contribution becomes mathematically invisible after a few centuries. The
Y chromosome preserves a direct paternal line stretching back hundreds, even thousands of years. If a surname was inherited alongside biological paternity, father to son, generation after generation, the Y chromosome should, in theory, preserve a record of that same unbroken chain. Researchers assembled Y-DNA samples from men carrying 13 of these rare, occupation-linked German surnames, families still living in the regions where the original offices had been documented in medieval court and church records. The expectation was modest. Most demographers assumed the results would show what they usually show: scattered lineages, unrelated by blood, unified only by a name adopted independently, or borrowed by servants and tenants from the noble households they served. For most of the surnames, that is roughly what happened. The DNA was diverse. Multiple unrelated paternal lines had converged, over centuries, onto the same name, probably because more than one family, in more than one village, held the same job title and eventually adopted it as a surname. But 3 of the 13 names did not behave that way. In these 3 lineages, a striking majority of the tested men, spread across different regions, different countries, sometimes separated by 400 or 500 kilometers, carried closely related Y chromosome haplotypes. Not identical, not proof of a single common ancestor beyond doubt, but related enough and consistent enough that the probability of independent, coincidental adoption of the surname became difficult to defend statistically. Researchers were careful in their language. This was not framed as certainty. It was framed as a signal, an unusually strong one, sitting inside data that was supposed to be genetically noisy by now. That was not a contradiction of the old story. It was something more interesting. It suggested that for a small number of these names, the surname had not simply labeled an occupation. It had, for centuries, tracked an actual paternal bloodline, one that began, plausibly, with a single man who held a specific office in service to a bishop, a duke, or the emperor himself, and whose descendants kept both the job and the name inside the family, generation after generation, long after the office itself had disappeared from history. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where a name, a job, and a genome quietly line up across 8 centuries, this is exactly the kind of story worth subscribing for, because there is far more hidden in ordinary family names than most people ever suspect. At this point, the investigation had to widen, because a strong correlation is not an explanation. Researchers laid out several possible frameworks for what they were seeing, and none of them were treated as final. The first explanation was straightforward hereditary office holding, a family that held a court position like Truxas or Kammerer for so many uninterrupted generations that the surname and the bloodline became functionally the same thing, reinforced by strict patrilineal inheritance customs common in medieval administrative families. The second explanation involved what geneticists call a founder effect. A single successful family, favored by a bishop or noble house, may have produced an unusually large number of surviving sons over several generations, sons who scattered into new villages, carried the name and the job with them, and effectively outreproduced other unrelated men who might have adopted the same occupational title independently. The third explanation was more unsettling to the neat version of the story: selective preservation of records. Church and court registries in the Holy Roman Empire were far more likely to carefully document families connected to official positions of the court than they were to document ordinary peasant households. This means that lineages tied to prestigious surnames may simply be better documented and better sampled today, creating a stronger apparent signal not because the biology was more unusual, but because the paper trail survived when others did not. Serious researchers hold all 3 possibilities open at once. The honest position is that the genetic data points to something real and non-random happening inside these 3 lineages, but it does not, by itself, prove an unbroken bloodline back to a specific medieval office holder named in an archive somewhere. What it proves is narrower and, in some ways, more remarkable, that for at least a few of these old occupational names, biology and title were bound together far more tightly and for far longer than historians assumed. The most significant evidence came from a broader comparative study, one that expanded the original small samples into a wider genomic panel, cross-referencing Y chromosome data with regional church records stretching back into the 1400s, and comparing the results against control groups of common, non-occupational German surnames from the same regions. This was the study that mattered because it was not just looking at rare names in isolation, it was asking whether the pattern held up against ordinary names as a baseline.
It did.
The common surnames showed exactly the genetic scattering you would expect after 5 or 6 centuries of intermarriage and independent adoption. The rare office-linked names in that narrow subset of 3 did not scatter the same way. The contrast, more than any single data point, was what convinced cautious geneticists that they were looking at something structurally different, not statistical noise. Here is the twist, and it is not the twist the title suggests. The DNA does not simply prove that a handful of German families descend, without interruption, from imperial nobility. That would be the simple, satisfying version, and it would also be an overstatement the evidence does not fully support. What the genome actually reveals is stranger than a clean bloodline. It reveals that occupation, geography, and paternity were, in a small number of families, locked together with unusual rigidity for the better part of 1,000 years, not because of noble blood in the romantic sense, but because of something more human, a family that held on to a specific job, in a specific place, and passed both the position and the paternal line down with a discipline that most families, across most of history, simply did not maintain. Not a fairy tale of hidden royalty. Something closer to a forgotten form of institutional memory, written not into a book, but into a chromosome. And that matters far beyond 13 German surnames. It suggests that human identity is not only carried in stories, coats of arms, or church registries. It is sometimes carried, quietly and invisibly, inside the biology of ordinary families who had no idea their Y chromosome was functioning like an unintentional archive. The Holy Roman Empire dissolved in 1806. Its offices, its courts, its emperors, all gone. But in a small cluster of villages, in the genetic material of men who have never worn a crown or held a treasury key, fragments of that vanished administrative world may still be quietly replicating themselves, one father to one son, without any of them realizing it. Picture one of those villages now, not the grand imperial court, but the ordinary place where the story actually lived. A cluster of stone houses along a slow river in the foothills of southern Germany, mist gathering low over the fields at dawn, church bells marking hours the way they have for 600 years. Somewhere in a record long since faded to brown ink, a name was written down beside a title, Kammerer, keeper of the chamber, and a man's son inherited both the job and the name without ever asking whether one day, centuries later, a laboratory would look inside his descendants' cells and find the shadow of that inheritance still there. That is the real discovery. Not proof of nobility. Proof of continuity, fragile, improbable, and mostly accidental continuity, surviving through plague, war, empire collapse, and migration, hidden inside a name most people assumed was just an old word for a job nobody does anymore. The old story said a surname was a label. The genome suggests that, in rare cases, a label can become a lineage, not because anyone planned it that way, but because history sometimes repeats itself through biology before anyone notices it is happening. If a story like this changes the way you look at your own last name, that is exactly the kind of quiet revelation worth sitting with and worth subscribing for, because history is still hiding inside places we stop looking. The empire is gone. The court offices no longer exist. But somewhere in a village most people have never heard of, a father is passing something down to his son that is older than the country he was born in, a signature written not on parchment, but in the oldest archive there is.